Welcome to the Decarbonisation Summit Automotive panel, a subject super close to my heart. And for those of you joining us online, you can pose questions via the live stream chat box. Today is the transport day at COP26, so we're really delighted to be able to bring an incredible panel to the Decarbonisation Summit this morning. And a big thank you to Autotrader, who are our panel partner for this panel. Autotrader are increasingly aware of the importance of decarbonisation in their business and of the huge rise in electric vehicles. So thanks very much indeed to them. To frame the scale of the issue, according to the UK government's Office for National Statistics, road transport accounts for a fifth of UK greenhouse gas emissions, so a significant contributor to carbon emissions and therefore a significant topic for conversation here this morning. To help us dive into that topic, let's introduce our panel of experts, and an incredible panel we have here today. So Dianne Smith, who is Project Development Manager at SSE Energy Solutions and leads on EV charging partnerships. Marc from Autotrader, Brand Director, leading their journey towards net zero with a commitment to driving change across the marketplace and supply chain. And Niall Riddell, Co-founder and CEO of Paua, a revolutionary startup that focuses on the simplification of EV charging by creating cutting-edge digital solutions to charge point access complications. Ralf Pfitzner, Head of Sustainability at VW Group, responsible for the setup and implementation of group-wide programs for sustainable business practices. So thank you all very much indeed for being part of this inaugural Decarbonisation Summit. If I could start off, please, by asking you for a few moments to tell us a little bit about what you're doing within your businesses to decarbonise. Dianne, would you like to take a lead on that one first, please?
Yeah, so within SSE Energy Solutions, we, as part of the EV infrastructure team, we are looking to adopt one of the UN sustainability goals and help get 1 million EVs on UK roads. For fleets, taxis, buses, haulage, and it's about working really collaboratively to help build a network of ultra-rapid charging stations across the UK and support fleets and businesses with their depot and home charging as well. Part of that is, we've all got to work collaboratively with local authorities, businesses. We need to become trusted advisors. And, probably our main message just now is, even if you're still on your decarbonisation journey about deciding what you're going to do with your fleets, start speaking to energy partners now. And because it can be a long transition and it's a lifelong relationship you really need to have with your charging partners. And working with, the automotive partners as well, and future products, and how we need to innovate to get transition to EVs as quickly as possible.
Thanks very much indeed, Dianne. Niall, I know you're a real pioneer in the sector, been involved in EV for very many years now. You started up your own company recently. What are you doing? What's the mission of Paua to decarbonise?
So we are trying to simplify public electric vehicle charging, and what we mean by that is I like to always describe to people who don't drive electric vehicles today this idea that you're driving down the road in your petrol or diesel vehicle, you look for your nearest fuelling opportunity because your fuel tank's low, it's a big red and yellow or a big green and yellow sign, you pull over, lots of opportunity, dozens of different pumps, you've got petrol or diesel, you plug in, don't plug in, you fill up your tank, a couple of moments later you step into the kiosk, you pull out your credit card, you pay, you get a receipt, you're back on the road. Electric vehicle charging, particularly in the public domain, is different. You need to know where these chargers are. They're not always obvious. They're hidden in car parks. They're around the corner of something. You've got to look for them. You need to know where they are. So you've got to find them. And then you've got to access those vehicles, those charge points if you want to charge your vehicle. So how do you do that? There's 75 different network operators here in the UK today, hundreds across Europe. Each of them has a slightly different app, a different card, a different subscription. So you turn up, you've got to then get access to this machine. And once you've got access, you then need to pay. And payment's obviously crucially important. How do we make that payment super simple? So if you're a fleet manager and you're trying to, charge your electric fleet in the public domain, you look at it and go, this is a nightmare. It's operationally impossible, some people say. So what we're trying to do is simplify that experience. So what we've enabled is a mobile phone application that marks up a number of different charge points you can find. You can then use this application to start the charge event, or if you're more conventionally minded, we've got a card. So you start the charge event, but the important bit is the bill goes back to the fleet manager. So you're simplifying that experience for the fleet manager. You're trying to make it easier for fleets and businesses in particular to adopt electric. And that's a huge part of the emissions from that road transport element you talked about.
Making decarbonisation easier is a key motif that we're discussing across the summit. So thanks very much indeed. Ralf, you're arguably one of the most significant players in the sector as head of sustainability at Volkswagen Group. As an ID3 owner myself, I'm hugely excited about seeing Volkswagen make this journey into sustainability and decarbonisation. Can you give us a quick sense of what you're doing in the sector, please?
Quick is difficult. I could talk for hours about it, and I'm so passionate about driving decarbonisation. But to give you an impression, I mean, Volkswagen roughly sells 10 million cars a year all across the globe, and the ultimate goal in order to decarbonize is to electrify them. So that's the ultimate goal. We are underway. ID3 is out on the market, ID4 is out on the market, Porsche Taycan, and a couple of other models. So it's now gaining momentum all across our portfolio, because in order to decarbonize transport, you have to electrify transport. This is first key message. Second one is it has to be based on renewable energy, because otherwise, I mean, powering a battery electric vehicle with brown coal lignite doesn't make sense. So we have to support the build out of renewables. That's what we do in our own factories. In Europe, we are all about 90% renewable in grid provision, where we purchase green energy. We are also walking further down the supply chain, working with our suppliers, obliging the battery cell manufacturers to use green electricity to produce our battery cells, because it's the next big step go into the supply chain. And the other one is, as you're an ID3 driver, I hope you have a green energy contract, because this is what is the big lever to further reduce emissions. So to put it in numbers, today, ICE vehicle and the comparable electric vehicle, so take a Golf versus ID3. Within the European energy mix, the ID3 is already 25% more CO2 efficient over the life cycle than the petrol car. And if you then have a green energy contract, and which we offer to our customers, for example, you can cut the remaining footprint of the ID3 in half. So it's 2/3 reduction versus the ICE. And this is the pathway we are on, supporting our customers in doing that in order to decarbonize transport.
Very good. I mean, the way I see it, the battle for electrification has been won. The next challenge is the battle for decarbonisation. So great to see that you're already well on that road. Marc, give us a sense of what you're doing over at Autotrader to decarbonise within the business.
Yeah. So why is Autotrader involved, and what is it that we feel we need to do within the market? So Autotrader is a huge marketplace for people researching and discovering their next car, new or used. We have 65 million cross-platform visits every month, and 60% of all time researching a car is done on Autotrader. So we have a great responsibility in a few different areas to do something about decarbonisation of transport. And we split that into three different parts, really. The first one is consumers. The next part is industry and government, advising them. And then the last part is our own business. So to take consumers, what we're doing is putting more environmentally friendly choices in front of people when they come to do that research and discovery. The latest of which is a cost comparator, simple cost comparator between a petrol or diesel car and an electric car, which compares the running costs of the two. Things like information and demystifying some of the terminology that we use is really, really important to us, and you'll see a lot of that sort of content on our site and on our channels. The next part, with all of those visits and all of that user behaviour, we're able to see what people are doing, what demand and interest looks like for electric cars, where is it, what cars are they looking at, what cars aren't they looking at, that kind of thing, what kind of people are looking at EVs. And we pass that information to industry, and by industry I mean automotive manufacturers, of course, but also government to OZEV, Her Majesty's Treasury, and also to energy, the energy sector. If you're going to invest in infrastructure, then you probably want to know where that should happen so that we can use it for that. And then the last thing within Autotrader, which is really important to us, there are a few initiatives which we've been working on for some time, actually. So in June 2021, we signed up to the Science Based Target Initiative to keep warming at 1.5%. What that means in the short summary of that is that we'll reduce emissions within our business by 50% by 2030. We were the first FTSE 100 company to be accredited with carbon literacy. We've trained 50% of our people by the spring within carbon literacy. If you haven't seen that, then I'd recommend having a look at it as a real good project to focus the mind. And then across our business, a bunch of different sustainability initiatives, which we take to educate our people and try to get them to make a difference both at home and in our business.
Very good. We spoke this morning on the energy panel about reframing language from perhaps cost to savings, and maybe that's something we can come on looking at a consumer education piece as we carry on the conversation. Delighted to say now that Sophie Adams, who's head of customer experience at the UK Government's Office for Zero Emissions Vehicles, has joined us. Sophie, thank you very much indeed for joining the panel. And obviously you're a government body. Perhaps the question should be less around what you're doing within OZEV to decarbonise and more about how you're influencing decarbonisation decisions around the sector. Could you give us some thoughts on that from an OZEV perspective, please?
So we're actually tackling that in a few different ways. So we provide grants for sort of the purchase of electric vehicles, and it's really about giving that direction of travel. So we're looking at how we invest in the sector. So we've invested really heavily in the wider infrastructure and giving confidence that this is actually the way forward. We can give millions of funding, billions even, but it's actually about making sure that we're driving that investment from the private sector as well. So this is actually where we're headed, is the rollout of electric vehicles. So it's not just about giving that private sector that confidence, but also consumers. So we tackle this from very much, a grants perspective, but also giving more information and understanding that the UK is really varied. There's not like a one size fits all. There's not like a silver bullet to tackling climate change, but it's working with different parts of the industry. So a lot of this has been mentioned by the other panelists, but thinking about how do we support local authorities that can be really varied, that have different skill sets, different backgrounds. I mean, if you take London, it's very different to Yorkshire. They're going to need various different bits of investment, various different bits of information, and even the consumers there are very different, and different types of infrastructure. So it's really tackling this from the economic and environmental different perspectives as well, but giving that information out. And it's also about leading the charge on fleets as well. That can sometimes feel a little bit forgotten, but actually they're really an important role to play. So what we're doing is like consulting and publishing more information on sort of the targets that we want to see, because 2050, 2030 is coming around very quickly. This will fly by in a heartbeat. So it's actually what can we do to speed up meeting these targets through investment, through more information, through just giving everyone in industry confidence that we're backing this, backing sort of the decarbonisation of transport. But we're also not doing this in isolation. I talk a lot about electric vehicles, but actually we can't just do it focusing on sort of just electric vehicles on its own. It's how do we support that wider ecosystem, and how do we get people sort of walking where possible, using buses, trains, and thinking about sort of those micro moments, those short hops as well, sort of onto different methods of transport, which is really exciting when you take it as a whole, not just as sort of one component of mobility.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie. So moving on to the main debate. It's perhaps very easy to be critical of governments when the emissions targets are perhaps not going to be met. But in the automotive sector, there are some really very positive initiatives. The UK government with a ban on pure combustion engine vehicles by 2030. Last week at COP26, 40 other governments getting behind a 2030 ban on combustion engine vehicles. So there are some impressive targets in place for us to follow, and that are really driving and motivating major players in the sector. But can we meet those ambitious targets? Maybe one for you, Ralf, first. There are some big issues at the moment, aren't there, with the supply of vehicles, with global supply chains. This is a major shift. Do you feel like you're able to meet these targets at VW?
Certainly, we are able to meet these targets, and the good news is that we are behind the point of no return in terms of the tipping point for electric mobility is reached. So we've seen throughout the last 9 months in terms of comparable sales to previous year, an increase of 130% of EV sales. Volkswagen Group now has a market share, I think, of 25-26% of EV sales in the European market. So we have really the uptake of e-mobility, and also to the point you mentioned, Marc, in the cost comparison and governmental grants in Germany with a subsidy of the government of around 8,000 up to 9,000 euros, you are already at the break even if you purchase an EV. And with the cost out on batteries, I think we will soon don't need these grants anymore, because driving an EV becomes more commercially interesting even for private users than driving in an ICE. So that's the good news. So the transition is going on. It is a huge challenge to convert the entire legacy business and to move all the supply chains towards electric vehicles, especially secure the production of batteries and the raw materials. So Volkswagen alone, we need for our share in the European market 6 gigafactories by 2030, which is really massive. And so we have to build out the European footprint also in terms of manufacturing, not only having all these things coming from China and Korea. So the transformation is really massive, but it's unstoppable. And I personally do believe while governmental set end dates for ICEs, they don't no longer move the needle that much. Because, I mean, yes, we have the European Fit for 55 plan where this in fact means a phase out of ICEs by 2035, and this is perfectly fine. I believe the customers' decisions will even promote faster the success of the EVs.
Yeah, I wonder whether the Osborne effect hasn't already kicked in, where people are thinking, I'm not going to buy yesterday's technology, I'll invest in an electric car. You've talked about the battery bottleneck there. I mean, I think another bottleneck, Dianne, is perhaps charging infrastructure. Do you think that will hold back this ambitious plan for the shift to electric vehicles? Yes,
I mean, I think you need to have the infrastructure there in tandem, or possibly first, before the vehicle. You know, there's lots of people will go ahead, get an electric vehicle and have a really bad experience because the infrastructure is not there. And that's where there's a risk, I think, of people then being, you know, oh, an electric vehicle doesn't work for me. They go back into an ICE vehicle, and that prolongs the speed of the transition into full EVs, I think. Because unfortunately, it'll be the vehicle that's judged as not being capable, not maybe the infrastructure per se. It's like, you know, people's emotional attachment to their vehicle is very much about how it works, where it goes, and we've all had, I'm sure, times when your vehicle doesn't go, and you quickly fall out of love with it. So I think the infrastructure needs to be there first to support all different types of communities, and for particularly, you know, not just private consumers, but for fleets, they need that operational effectiveness. They need that infrastructure to be there to operate. And they're only going to do that when they're 100% sure that it's there to support them.
Very good. Niall, I'm sure you've got some strong views on how we may meet or not meet these ambitious targets. What's your sense of this?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I'm 100% behind Dianne. You know, we've got to get this infrastructure right, and I think there's also this amazing opportunity with the infrastructure we're deploying to convert it from what was a 1980s technology of credit cards and rather smelly petrol stations into a future which is much more seamless, much more digital, much more integrated. You know, I'm loving a future where the Tesla experience that a lot of people talk about, you know, the car knows where the charger is, they know they can turn up, it plug in, off it goes. I want to see that in Volkswagen. I want to see that in Renault. I want to see that in all manufacturers, because fundamentally behind all of this, humans, hate to say it, guys, we're all a bit lazy. So the easier we can make it for us to adopt that ecosystem, the better. And you're totally right. You know, we are seeing that tipping point where people are now going, I like this technology. I'd like to have some of that technology. What is it? How does it work? What is a kilowatt? And what's a kilowatt hour? And the journey that we're having to go on to, and, you know, we're both electrical geeks. We've spent too long in large energy companies. But the journey we're having to go on to take people from this pence per litre, which kind of people get, or miles per gallon, people understand that, into a miles per kilowatt hour. So your average electric vehicle is doing 3 miles per kilowatt hour. Is that good or bad? Don't know. I need a battery that is X miles, or is it kilowatt hours? And am I putting kilowatt hours or kilowatts into my car? That simple experience of changing a scientific unit from litres to kilowatts is really crucial. So I think there's a policy driver, but there's also this, I don't like the word, there's this educational piece. How do we get the right information to the right people? And that's kind of where people like yourselves come in to really help people understand and not get afraid by acronyms and things. So there's a real human dimension.
Marc,
it's education, but it's also experience and trying out things, experimentation, because the best thing, I believe, to convince someone from electric driving is having an electric vehicle for one day.
Yeah.
And if you once used it, you don't want to miss it. This is the cool thing about e-mobility. It feels better. It's less noise, it's no direct emissions, and it's also less other emissions beyond CO2. So that's the good news. But I fully agree the infrastructure has to be in place. And while we on the manufacturer side, we're producing cars and we're also heavily investing in infrastructure on our own, building joint ventures for fast charging along motorway networks. But there's also, from our perspective, a big role of the government to set the right boundary conditions. And like the electricity grid once was built out, the water grid, this is a public-private effort we have to fulfill here and really speed up the build-out of networks. It might even, so in short term, get worse in terms of user experience because we see the steep ramp-up of car sales. We see a slower ramp-up of infrastructure, so that's what we have to work on.
I think that's where the automotive brands really can make such a difference, because that's where all your brand marketing and all these experiences that customers will love for life, that's where you can really ramp up, people's enjoyment of EVs.
Sure.
And that whole marketing.
Marc, you're tracking the data around customer experiences and rise of EV in the business side of things. Do you think these ambitious targets will be met from your data analysis perspective?
They won't, certainly in the UK, so obviously we can speak only from a UK perspective, excuse me, and they will be met because that will be legislation, right? So by 2030, there will be a ban on sales of petrol and diesel cars, and that will be that. We will meet that target. The important thing, I think, is how we meet those targets, and we've touched on a bunch of the different key barriers, enablers, obstacles, whatever, in the last few minutes here, and there's a need for focus in three different areas, I think. First of those is definitely incentives. Really interested when Ralf mentions the degree of subsidy that's available for the purchase of an electric vehicle in Germany, which is 3 times that in the UK. And the fact is that for more than 40% of people, anybody, the general public in the UK, upfront cost is a key barrier to buying an electric car. They cost on average £10,000 more than the petrol version, right? But that just knocks loads of people out of being able to afford one. And the used car market, until a car is about 4 years old, those cars do not become more cost effective to own. So there's a real immaturity in the used car market, which is precluding many people from getting into electric. New car is £10,000 more expensive. That must change, and there's a need for incentives to get to that. Running costs aren't quite at the level where they knock those things out. That just isn't happening at the moment. On average, cars are still, whilst they do give you a fuel saving, not closing that gap. So there's an incentive need. Investment in infrastructure is the next big thing. The uptake we see so far in the data on electric vehicles, the interest, those people that are most likely to buy an electric car, is in affluent areas of the UK. Sophie just mentioned London there being different to Yorkshire. East London is different to West London. There is no city pattern. North of Bristol is different to central Bristol. Wealthy areas is where you see EV interest. And what that's doing is leaving behind the mass market. There is a gap between affluent people that have got the money and can charge at home and everybody else. And until that gap is closed, then we will struggle to get to 2030 in answering that question. How do we do that? Of course, what do those people need? The mass market needs to know I can afford it and it won't cost me any more money. And it is as convenient, if not more convenient, than having a petrol car. And that's where infrastructure, of course, comes in. They need to know that it's okay to have one and it's as convenient as the car they would have. So those are the two key things I would say. Investment in infrastructure and incentives. And then the last thing would be around that information. Taking away all that, I don't know what a kilowatt hour is, and I've worked in the car market or industry for more than 20 years. I don't actually care. I just need to know that the car will do the thing I need it to do, and that's the case for most people. So that's just one example of where information needs to help people make the right kind of choices.
So, Sophie, your job title is Head of Customer Experience. Give us some thoughts on that customer experience piece, please, in terms of how we will meet these ambitious targets.
Well, I think information and spinning into a positive light is key, because the negative messaging is just so strong. It doesn't take much and like a few bad experiences, and that resonates through the entire industry, whereas actually the majority have a positive experience. So we've been looking at how do we tackle some of those really key problems that consumers are really having trouble with now. So things like being able to find the charge point for your needs, because not every charge point can be seen across the network, which is mad. You should be able to understand sort of how to plan your journey and understand like the asset. So whether it has a contactless terminal, which parking bay it is in, exactly where it's situated along the road. So things like that. I mean, we've consulted on all of this earlier in the year, and we're going to be publishing our government response really shortly. But it goes back to sort of how do you make sure that the network is reliable and working, and sort of what does it mean, you know, if the screen is slightly cracked or someone has blocked the bay, sort of how do we make sure that we can literally unblock some of these challenges? And while we can do this sort of in a regulatory way, I think it goes back to working with industry to understand, okay, how can we speed this up? These are known issues. These have been known for quite a few years, and sort of still continue to happen. Mm-hmm. So it's really understanding that how do we give that positive messaging that we're doing this work now, and this needs to speed up. But going back to things like the secondhand market, the essential component here is still fleets. It's understanding how do we make sure that it's business and like domestic EV drivers that have an overwhelming positive experience, and that there's some consistency. I think consistency and having a boring or sort of non-like experience. People want to have a forgettable experience when charging. The moment it's no longer technology, but actually it is just part of your day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. That's a win. Like we don't want it to be an experience. I think that's when you get rid of my job title and it's just something more to do with supporting infrastructure. That's the best outcome. So we need to tackle some of these big components now and speed up the adoption, just so that consumers are able to have an easier life. And yes, with grants and making it cheaper for all consumers to adopt electric vehicles is key, and that is something that we're really looking at government, so that no consumer is left behind. And so we're doing quite a lot of work on inclusive design as well, and understanding that anyone with visible and non-visible disabilities have access to the right charge points for their needs. So there's a lot of cross-cutting work that we're doing to just understand sort of what are those big barriers and start ticking them off sort of in quick succession, really.
Niall, you're doing a lot of nodding here. I think you might have something to pick up on this conversation. Is there something you want to add to that?
I guess one of the things that I'd almost like to pick up between both of you is I'm a bad person to have on an automotive panel. I'm not a car guy. I'm an infrastructure and tech guy. So I've always bought second-hand cars. So along comes these lovely-looking new electric cars. They've got lots of cool tech in, really like it. I'm not going to buy a new car. I've never bought a new car. So I've kind of adopted the other side of this equation, which is the new and emerging business models we're seeing around car ownership. So I'm subscribed to a car. So I have a car on a monthly basis from Elmo, but others, I think you were an On2 customer, weren't you? And then there's Voltric and others who are developing these mobility as a service offerings. So no longer do you have to go in your checkbook and pull out a massive chunk of cash. What we're starting to see is people adopting new ownership models. The ability to then flexibly drop that car, I don't need it, COVID, not driving, hand the car back, or change the vehicle, means that I think we're going to see a new breed of consumer access in this market. And I'm quite worried about some of the bits that Marc's raised. You know, this idea that we're creating the haves and have-nots of this ecosystem. We are today in the UK, so in the middle of December, we're going to break through about 1% battery electric vehicles on the road in the UK. So we're very, very early. We're right at the early stage of the innovation element. We're going to go, quite a long way before we hit the sort of early adopters. But as we go through that journey, we've got to learn from the 1% and make sure that we're catering for the 99%. And that 99% includes those who don't have private driveways. They can't charge at home overnight. They maybe don't have the disposable income to buy a new car. So second-hand car market becomes crucial. Or they're those who are going to be relying on a different kind of lifestyle. And this is why I think business adoption of vehicles is really interesting, because businesses are adopting vehicles for their drivers, and those are drivers who might not necessarily be the first customer for an electric vehicle. So they're kind of being forced to adopt a new technology by their fleet manager or by their company, which they're not necessarily ready for. So we're starting to see vans, electric vans, and I mean it's a small number compared to personal cars, but we're starting to see a lot more electric vans, the likes of Centrica and DPD, rolling their fleets out. And drivers are having to have a different experience. And they're the ones we're almost going to have to watch most closely, because they're doing high mileage, they're out on the road a lot, they perhaps can't charge at home. If we can make the ecosystem work for a driver at Centrica, a driver at DPD, then surely we're in a place whereby we can enable that ecosystem to become a much smoother experience. So I think we need to learn from the 1% and build for the future, build for the 99%.
Picking up on your point, Ralf, do you see at Volkswagen that a new type of consumer or non-consumer is developing? And are you looking to develop, or are you developing leasing plans, subscription plans to meet this changing marketplace?
I would say there's multiple roads of innovation associated in the first instance with electric driving. Second one, at the forefront, we also see autonomous driving coming up in the, let's say, second half of this decade. So there will be fundamental changes. And on the one hand, pointing to what you just said, business fleet owners play a major role in the adoption of EVs. And from my perspective, the good news is that many corporates have their internal decarbonization goals, and one part of their goal fulfillment is to electrify their fleets for their user-chooser drivers and so forth. So there is huge momentum, and this will also fuel then the second-hand market in a few years. So that's where basically companies buy, or you have those leasing models. What we will see much more than in the past is the rental car business, short-term lease, and let's say intensified usage, especially for urban areas when emissions go away. Space usage does not go away if you electrify a car. So for cities, we will see much more car-sharing solutions, short-term rental, ride-sharing services, and so we're working on these, also entering into the rental car business again with our plans. So there is innovation definitely to come. We even think ahead that, let's say, a lifetime lease model might be something, because if we know that the battery is a significant chunk of the value and the end of life of an electric vehicle, there is 700 kilos, 600 kilos of precious raw materials, which we basically want to have for production of new batteries or for second life applications of batteries. Then you have to think of new models of, let's say, not the private user owning a car, but us owning the car over the lifetime and selling the usage, selling 100,000 miles or whatever.
And then that builds in a circular economy function.
Yeah, exactly. That's the
model.
buzzword I wanted to hear.
Very good. Good. Dianne, I know fleets is a big part of your work, but I'll come on to that in a second, if I may. Marc, you're tracking consumer behaviour as a key part of your work. Do you see the rise of the non-consumer? Do you see the rise of the eco-conscious consumer who's worried about carbon emissions and therefore transitioning to electric vehicles?
Yeah, there are a couple of different points in there, aren't there? So the eco-conscious consumer, we've seen definitely a growth in people's, a trigger to consider an electric car being climate consciousness, and a growth in climate consciousness over the last couple of years. Cost is still the main trigger, or cost saving is still for many the key trigger, and that's those people obviously that can afford that initial upfront cost. So that is an emerging thing, and that's fine. In terms of changing ownership models, not yet, no. This could happen at some point in the future. It could happen after 2030. I think that 2030, we need to focus on 2030 now. Different types of usership or ownership or whatever may come at some point. We surveyed people a couple of years ago, and the interest was pretty low. people like the idea of flexible ownership, and I'd like a certain type of car in the summer and a different one in the winter and a big one for big trips and that kind of. They like that, but they want exclusive access to a car, whether they subscribe to it, buy it on a PCP, buy it outright, whatever they do. People want their own car. That has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. People are less likely to share cars post-COVID than they were pre-COVID because of concerns over personal safety and their own space, which is, so if that was a growing theme of a small level, that has been knocked back. I would say that the pressing priority right now is to get more people into these cars, is not to worry about different ownership types and usership types, but just to make them more affordable and give them the means to make them move. And that applies to used as well as new. As I was saying, a nearly new family hatchback electric is more expensive than a new one in the UK. That doesn't make any sense at all, that the nearly new one-year-old car costs more to buy than the new one on a monthly finance basis, and that's because of subsidies and all those other things. Those sorts of things need to be addressed for wider adoption. And I wouldn't worry about different models just yet. We need to fix these two big things around investment and infrastructure pretty quickly.
Very good. We'll come on to the question of fleets. But Sophie, anything you'd like to add to this question?
I think there's, a lot of amazing stuff has been said already, but I think, it is just, there's a lot more barriers that are there to solve, particularly around sort of how do we get to our net zero targets faster, and which are the big hitting issues that we can tick off first. And I think it comes back to that, what can we solve? And again, it might not be that you can do all of it right now, but it's what can we do that makes the most impact and solve those issues and make sure that it's as inclusive as we can, and start ticking off some of those other issues. So investment is obviously key, but also again it goes back to giving the confidence that this is going to be happening. there's no escape from the fact that we're going sort of with the rollout with electric vehicles, for particularly for consumers and fleets. So it's really making sure that we're giving the backing to that, and working with local authorities and just continuing that work, really.
Very good, thank you. And so let's move on to the question of fleets. 50% of vehicles are bought by businesses. It's a key vector. Should we really focus on fleets, Dianne, do you think, because they're such an important way of getting people into electric vehicles?
Yes, absolutely. I think in terms of, your sort of company car driver, the government, the benefit in kind tax rates have been reduced. It's been a driver for company car drivers for many years. The CO2 levels of their vehicles impacted how much they paid in benefit in kind every month. And you could look at sector reports on a month-to-month and registrations. And you would see the swing from one vehicle to the next. That sort of brand loyalty is sort of lost a bit, I think, with the benefit in kind. So we can really leverage that. And I do think the government should continue to keep those benefit in kind rates low, because otherwise, if there's not a benefit to taking an EV as a company car, a lot of people might leave their company car schemes and go into grey fleet. And in that case, as a price parity part comes in, and they go back to an ICE vehicle because it's cheaper when they go to the retailer to buy it. And I think as well, with your second-hand car market, we need these second-hand EVs to come through the market, and residuals to start being set, and possibly, scrappage schemes introduced for your older Euro 5 diesels and things, to stimulate that transition for the volume that you were speaking about, Marc. So.
Ralf, you head up sustainability at Volkswagen. Do you see fleet buyers increasingly concerned about sustainability and emissions issues in their purchasing decisions?
Well, as I've said before, the good news is on the fleet operators and fleet customers, especially in business, they very often have their own CO2 reduction targets, be it same as we have, carbon neutral by 2050, reducing life cycle emissions over the entire portfolio by 2030 by 30%. So this is what drives our customers on the fleet side, and therefore, apart from, let's say, the early adopters who are the EV addicts and fans of EV, there are now big signals coming from business. So yes, there is changing behavior, and also in terms of the big decarbonization plans of the corporates. I mean, if you're an employee, if you're a manager at a company, the EV is one tangible signal for the credibility of your employer's efforts to decarbonize. And therefore, I think it's a very important role the fleets play in.
I know you've been at COP26 for a number of days. Do you see that impetus on business being catalyzed and strengthened as a result of COP26?
The question is if the inputs on business are catalyzed or if the inputs by business catalyze the outcome of COP. Because Paris used to be my very first COP 5 years ago. That was the first COP with a significant business presence. And there the good news was renewable energy is cost competitive. So we're going to make the energy transition. That was the big signal from business towards policymakers, that it's no longer about, okay, it's costing. It's saving money in the long term. Yeah. Now at this COP, we have strong signals from business that we're creating tangible momentum. The solutions are there. The rubber hits the road. If we talk about EV sales numbers, if we talk about capacity additions on the renewable and solar power side, if we're talking about green steel, where huge investments are going to be directed. I think these are the big signals coming from business towards policymakers, and I think there is, at least the leading corporates say, let's be more ambitious on climate goals and hopefully all across all countries. So I would turn that rather around. Yes, on the other hand, boundary conditions, policy making is important for us as well, for sure.
Niall, your take on the fleets question.
There's a couple of stats which are escaping me entirely at the moment, but the piece that I think is really interesting is your sort of 1/5 of UK emissions is coming from transport. If you then break that down into where it's coming from in transport, you quite quickly see that a lot of it is coming from HGVs and commercial vehicles. They're doing higher mileage. The average business vehicle in the UK does 18,000 miles a year. The average individual driver does 7,000 miles a year. I ran a quick calculation this morning. The average HGV is doing potentially hundreds of thousands of miles a year. So to see, statements around moving both commercial vehicles to zero emissions and then HGVs to zero emissions is like it's a pretty big commitment because, and I'm no expert, and I went on Autotrader this morning to have a little look, which, by the way, does do HGVs. If you want to buy yourself a 44-ton Arctic, there is a £25,000 one available. It's done 700,000 miles. It was registered in 2017. There's stuff in there that I just didn't even comprehend. But, there's a whole ecosystem above and beyond the world that we're probably familiar with of passenger vehicles, which really, really has almost a bigger impact on carbon emissions, which is where we're going to have to make some really hard strides. So, one of the things I really like is Amazon adopted a lot of electric vans. Then the Mercedes Sprinters, so you see them popping around now. Obviously, there's all the Rivians out in the US. Those vehicles are on average 2 meters longer than your average parking bay. So a van driver decides to go and fill up at a public charging bay. Doesn't fit.
And we need to develop the infrastructure.
We need to develop the infrastructure.
To suit these long wheel-based vehicles as well.
And then hopefully for these HGVs.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's maybe where, the bus operators come in. Can they share that charging infrastructure
which you guys
with
are looking
haulage?
at, aren't you?
During the day, the haulage could come in and charge up while the buses are charging overnight. We need to think about sharing all our investment with the whole community and the whole ecosystem, and not thinking that we all need our own private charging station, which is really ridiculous because we don't all have our own private petrol station, so we all need to share these.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the insight on the Autotrader truck side. I was looking for a 16-ton truck for our second vehicle, so now I know.
I'm sure Autotrader can sort you out.
I know where to get it. Marc, please give us some insights from an Autotrader perspective on this fleets question.
There are lots of good points made there on there, and this starts to make us realise that it's not a good idea, a sensible idea, to try to deal with individual opportunities or barriers one by one. To talk about private, to talk about fleet, to talk about commercial vehicles. to talk about off-street parking, off-street charging, destinations and community hubs and things. There needs to be more conversation around bringing those things together. There is, I was at a conference a few weeks ago where there were investors who have money to spend on charging infrastructure and would like to invest that for the long term. Their key concern, of course, is traffic and utilisation. And if, of course, we only think about charging as an on-street private driver opportunity that might charge it up overnight and everybody's trying to do the same thing and there are 7 homes trying to use the one station, that won't be the answer that we need to get to. There will be fleets that will charge overnight and there will be private drivers or taxi owners or commercial vehicle drivers that will do things during the daytime or at weekends or whatever. And it feels to me like if we fragment the problem or if we continue to talk about the challenge in a fragmented manner, then we will struggle to find fast solutions. So I would hope that we can kind of bring solutions together which talk with fleet, with infrastructure and try to make sure, and private investment, that we are using the best solution to meet everybody's needs.
However, I'd like to shed some light on the truck business because I'm responsible for Volkswagen Group, which also apart from Volkswagen, Audi and Porsche, also contains MAN and Scania. So we have a significant truck business. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, so let's say the share of road-based CO2 emissions is probably 60-40, 70-30. So passenger cars, 2/3, 1/3. The trucks, despite the higher mileage, but the passenger cars are more of them. The good news is on the truck side, we're experiencing a fast transformation. And I just talked yesterday to our Scania CEO, and they even wouldn't have expected that battery electric trucks become competitive and technology-wise feasible so fast. So by mid of this decade, 2025, they will have in all ranges up to 40-ton trucks. They will have battery electric trucks available. I think they think about 30% new sales on the truck side by 2030 in Europe on the electrified side. So that's really promising. And while I agree that we don't need to separate things too much, when it comes to heavy-duty transport and charging infrastructure, this is a completely different story. So our Scania colleagues just founded a joint venture with Mercedes and others to set up that infrastructure. Because if you talk truck charging, you talk for single charging 600 kilowatts plus up to 1 megawatt. If you did that on the normal street, probably you would create a blackout. So you need to have that charging infrastructure for the heavy duties where the power lines are and basically at those depots where the truck drivers take a break or stay overnight because they're forced to take a break due to legislation anyway every 2 or 4 hours. There they need to charge, and therefore heavy-duty charging infrastructure is a slightly different story, but for light-duty and passenger cars, we should certainly combine it.
Yeah, I mean, the truck sector is a huge emissions problem, isn't it? So certainly one that needs to be addressed. We've discussed fleets, we've discussed the shift to e-mobility. You referenced, Ralf, the circular economy side. Let's think about that wider sustainability picture. So, you know, the transition to electrification is great, but we still have that wider story around decarbonising the entire business ecosystem. Tell us a little bit about what Volkswagen is doing on that side, please, Ralf.
Well, decarbonising the ecosystem, well, it's not 100% done by electrifying cars because, as mentioned before, we have to work with SSE and others to bring more renewable power in the grids and also have the governmental plans in place because basically to decarbonize the industry, electricity consumption will double because we need green electricity for thermal processes and for many more. So this is the key call for the ecosystem and where we are also acting. We founded a so-called European CEO lines for Europe's recovery, resilience and reform with utility partners such as Enel, E.ON, Iberdrola. We have our Scania colleagues on board. We have tech companies such as ABB, and we're jointly supporting the European Union also in advocacy saying this has to happen, and we are in favor of the European Green Deal in this case. So that's also reaching out to policymakers, overarching across sectors. I'd like to add one aspect beyond decarbonization to your question, because what is also very important when we talk about EV transformation, it's all those questions, and it goes back to education. what about the raw materials? What about human rights standards? What about labor standards? What about environment topics? And there is also, on the one hand, a lot of myth and truth out there, but there's also some challenges. And we are working on these challenges to also clean up the supply chains and make them more sustainable. And this is rightfully that criticism comes from some NGOs, that they put it on the agenda. One can say with ICEs, it's similar challenges because apart from Brent Spar and Deepwater Horizon, people don't care that much about what happens in the oil and gas industry. But nevertheless, it's good that these topics on clean and sustainable supply chains are discussed and that we're working on this. So this is part beyond decarbonization on that sustainability journey.
Can you give us some insights into what you're doing on the supply chain side? What are you doing with the partners you work with?
So we are, on the decarbonization side, for example, we have contractual obligations for our battery cell manufacturers that they have to use green electricity for manufacturing the battery cells. We're also mapping supply chains from tier 1 to tier 8, basically down to the mine. We're cleaning up supply chains, tracking raw materials, including using the blockchain technology to make sure that, for example, cobalt for the cathodes comes from clean smelters and not from artisanal mining. We are supporting projects on the ground, for example, in the DRC, together with partners that help developing the working conditions for those poor people on the ground, supporting education, schooling, and make also this artisanal mining, which is existing, more sustainable, that their products also can, based on good EHS and human rights standards, be fed into the value chain. So it's working on the ground, and it's working with many partners all along the value chain, such as in the global battery lines, where mining companies, cell manufacturers, OEMs work together to make supply chains clean and transparent.
In perhaps an unrelated subject, yesterday we looked at fashion and retail and how there was a disconnect going back through the supply chain to the raw materials side. So it's great to hear that you're making that connection. Dianne, Ralf referenced renewable energy. I know SSE are very, very active on the renewable energy side. Are you working with a bunch of OEM partners and other industry players to decarbonise the sector on that side?
Well, when we're looking at putting our sort of network of ultra-rapid charging hubs in, we will be using 100% renewable energy, which feeds into that. So if we had OEM partners that, for talking sake, wanted to have a Volkswagen hub, we could build that and invest in it, maintain and operate it for them, and they would have 100% renewable electricity.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Neil, what's your take on the wider sustainability ecosystem piece?
So I'm going to take and go back to what Ralf was saying about businesses leading. Back in 2007, I was part of the Committee on Climate Change when we were looking at setting carbon budgets. And following that and launch of the carbon budgets, the UK government had made a decision which not many day-to-day consumers are aware of, which is there's two basic ways for a country to manage its carbon emissions. You do it on production, that's stuff I burn here, and you do it on consumption, and that's stuff that got burnt somewhere else that I'm importing. So the UK's carbon budget is entirely based on production. It's stuff I burn here. So what it's not doing is any of the life cycle assessment.
Yeah.
So having run a life cycle assessment for a nuclear power station back in the day, it's a horribly complex piece of maths to do. So totally get the idea of putting some blockchain in there and doing that full, where's it provenance, where's the materials come from, all that sort of stuff. It's a hard thing to do. So to hear that businesses are almost accounting for their environmental impact better than governments is really interesting. So, there's a question in here around how does a government, which, by the way, it's really hard to work out everything that's come across your borders, how does a government go about ensuring that we're getting a more sustainable supply chain, a more sustainable economy? So I think the question in here, which would be boring to some but really important to others, is how do we get some carbon pricing that goes across the economy? Mm-hmm. And I don't mean the UK economy, I don't mean the European economy, the global economy. We need that global level of carbon pricing. So for me, that's really important. I think the other thing that's really nice to hear, Dianne's EV chargers are all going to have renewable power behind them. We're very fortunate that when we started out on our ambition as Paua to look at how we enable electric vehicle charging, a few people said, can you tell us how much carbon I'm using? Well, I haven't bothered because all of the partners we've engaged with so far, building public charging networks in the UK, they all have renewable backed tariffs. The human psyche as you adopt an electric vehicle is to start to look at your life cycle a little bit harder. I've just made a rather important purchase decision. I'm buying an electric vehicle. It's because I want to save the planet. Okay, do I have a green tariff? Do I have efficient houses? Do I have solar panels on my roof? And the consumer conscious runs through these choices much faster once they've made that hard commitment to a rather expensive piece of technology. But, like you say, it's not available to everyone. We've still got a long journey to go on to get more people into these cars which are too expensive.
Marc, I'll come to you in a second, but Sophie, over at OZEV, what's your sense from government working on the wider sustainable ecosystem, circular economy piece?
Yeah, I mean, hugely important, and it's obviously a really confusing landscape as well. So I think almost it needs to be split into, okay, so what can we do sort of with government and industry and understand, like you're saying, like that circular economy, how can we reuse the batteries, sort of once it's EVs are nearing end of life, how can they be reused in the home as batteries, because they still have 70% of like their charging capacity. So what can we do next? So I think there's a definite split with understanding, how sustainable generally are we, and this is why obviously Transport Day COP26, is the opportune moment to get everyone around a table and agree sort of what we're going to do next. But then it's also for the consumer, you can start small. I mean, just moving to an EV and then sort of encouraging that smart meter uptake, and then sort of incrementally going. I mean, I would struggle with like a big bang approach. I've just recently got a smart meter into my flat, and it's basically giving that sort of those nudges to consumers that I don't expect everyone to completely understand everything all at once, but there is that kind of, and like we're adopting everywhere, it is that phased incremental approach and making it a bit more palatable, a bit more bite-sized, because it's terrifying to suddenly adopt this all at once. But there needs to be that greater visibility of that end-to-end chain and sort of the accountability of that as well. There's, people need to be, you need to understand actually where this has come from. But again, it goes back to sort of what you can do as a consumer, and then have that strong steer from government and industry that, yes, we're working on this bigger picture as well.
Marc, from an Autotrader perspective, do you see consumers asking those tricky questions about just how green the sector is?
Yes and no, and a small number of them are becoming more conscious of that kind of thing. But as I said, the swell at the moment is primarily, or the increased interest is around. It's beginning to start to make sense for more people, and I would say, in answer to the question around ways to think about the kind of the wider challenge. I mean, that really, if we tried to answer that question for a consumer on a website, would be adding much more confusion to what is. It's hard for them to work out how far a car is going to go on a full charge. If we start talking about other decarbonisation initiatives elsewhere and around the build of that car and the life cycle of that car, we risk adding more confusion to the pot. What I would say is really that business, what I'm really finding optimistic is in the few years that I've been talking about this sort of stuff with manufacturers and with government and with other organisations, is that there is a real desire to learn more and to talk much more openly about what they can do to decarbonise transportation. That's a given. So there has been a great tipping point, imperceptible almost, but we're all in a good place. It feels like it would be, you can't not do this. So focusing on what businesses can do is probably, I think, rather than try to think about the breadth of everything, think about what we can do, and what for Autotrader that means is providing our insight and our data to organisations within, departments within government, of course, to show them what kind of people are looking at electric cars and what kind of support others might need in order to access that kind of transportation. Not for us to, of course, try to suggest policy or anything like that, but just to say, here's what's happening. Now, you can use this. For the energy sector, we can start to talk to, or we are talking to businesses about areas in the UK in which they might choose to make their investment. We talked earlier on about utilisation and traffic and so on. You'd want to know that sort of thing. And then with consumers, the main thing for us is to try to get them to understand that more environmentally friendly choices are available, and to take away some of that confusion and that language so they can make those choices more easily.
Very good. We only have a few minutes left, so I just want to go around the table and ask all of you, from the things you've learnt in this panel discussion, from the ideas shared? What are the things that perhaps inspire you from some of the other people you've heard on the panel? Maybe I'll start with you, Dianne.
I think what's been really interesting from what Marc's saying is, like, we do actually have, you know, sort of demystifying what's going to happen. We do actually have a lot of data that is available, and we all sort of need to maybe share a bit more. I think the great thing from sort of what Ralf was saying about the whole sustainability piece for Volkswagen and the amount of vehicles it produces is that things are definitely changing, and there's no going back to ICE, really, which is great as well.
Thank you. Niall?
I think the thing I'm taking away most is a combination of a high level of energy, enthusiasm and interest. And you know this, Aid, but you know, this is an early stage market, but we have a bunch of really big companies sat right here on this panel, and we're a tiny little company. So to hear the amount of interest, engagement and activity going on to try and tackle this big problem, that's what's probably most compelling. We have the technology. We have the ambition, we have the desire. We're starting to see the consumer moving towards it. You know, the fact that you're getting the searches and the interest, you're helping people make those decisions. We're getting the policy and regulation to shape what we're doing. The vehicles are available. The infrastructure is being built around us. That's so exciting. That's something to almost celebrate, because we can make the difference. We can make the transition, but it's going to be hard. There's a lot to do, but with the enthusiasm and energy, we will make it.
Ralf, I was excited to hear that you're going deep into the supply chain in terms of your understanding of sustainability matters. What have you learned on the panel today that you think is interesting and exciting?
I think there's a couple of key takeaways. On the one hand, what Sophie and Dianne said on the charging infrastructure. I mean, this is probably a mutually shared insight that we have to be fast in a build-out of the infrastructure, and also it's not private sector only, it's not public sector only. It's a cooperation, and we really have to be ambitious on that one. The other part which strikes me, we have to be mindful about complexity. If we think about especially the private consumers, I mean, one thing is, the fun part is if you try out an EV, you never want to miss it. So bringing people into that car. The other thing is, don't bother the private consumers too much with mathematical units and technology details. We have to basically make it digestible, all the information about the energy and sustainability journey and the decarbonization journey. So that's a key take, and thinking about the platform. So what is the appropriate information that helps consumers make the best decision? That's something which resonates.
It's simple.
Yeah.
And Marc, what ideas have inspired you from the discussion?
Yeah, just to pick up on that, that's a lovely point. We have a survey we run every year. When we ask people, one of the questions, what do you love most about your car? Electric car owners are twice as likely to talk about performance and the fun of driving their car than a usual kind of normal car driver. There's a lovely kind of swell of enjoyment within electric vehicle ownership, and that's one thing that I've got from the panel today. There's a huge amount of optimism and excitement you can take from this. I would say that there is a wonderful opportunity for much more collaboration. Mutual sharing was a phrase you just used there, Ralf, which I think is really, really important. And if we can get the right people with the right information, we're all heading for the same objective, okay? If we can get those right people in the right conversations, then we can make faster progress than we're making at the moment.
As an EV driver, I'm twice as likely to bore my friends talking about sustainability, rather, but I know I'm a strange creature. Sophie, a word from you, please. What ideas have you learnt on the panel that inspire you?
I think we're all coming from the same place, that we all want this to happen and quickly. But I think the thing that's resonated with me most is that there's different sort of really key different elements to this that we need to take on, especially for consumers, just getting even just high level information just to say, do this thing, transition to, or help us transition to net zero, the fleets element, which is really important, and then also that back end sustainability. How do we make sure sort of that we're dealing with that sort of in a really collaborative way, and give everyone sort of that is actually just driving around doing their day-to-day business, that confidence that they don't have to worry about it. They can find more information if they want, but actually that is all being dealt with in the background. So I think it's the key thing for me is how do we continue that discussion, get sort of that comms element out really, and sort of will be really much more coordinated about that. So people are really feeling quite positive about sort of the future, and sort of spin that negativity, that negative language around sort of fairly sharpish.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie, and thank you to the rest of our panel for this hugely stimulating and positive conversation around the shift to decarbonised automotive on this Transport Day at COP26. This afternoon, we will shift tack onto the subject of gender, diversity and decarbonisation. But for now, thanks once again to this supremely good panel, and we look forward to joining you later. Thank you very much indeed.